All right, hello everyone. We're trying something a little different here. It's not impromptu because Jan and I had already talked about doing something in advance with regard to a topic, but we've had a lot of ideas bouncing around. But I think here we kind of landed on what we just want to play around with and see where it goes. Maybe this will be something, or maybe if you happen to end up watching this in the only place where it ends up being stored at, which will be really hard to do because I usually make them private. Either way, if you happen to watch this while we're doing it right now, or if I accidentally change the settings and you watch this, or if this makes it to YouTube because it turns out to be good, well, then you know that it's probably good because I felt like it's worthy of putting up there. Or maybe it's really bad and everybody else thinks it's fine, it's bad, or I don't know.
Anyway,
It could
we'll
go.
see. You'll find you're invited to come along with us.
Yes, it should be at the very least an interesting ride, an interesting discussion that we both have some differing opinions on, some similar opinions on, and a lot of gray matter in between to start discussing. So what we're going to be talking about here is dominate. I'm calling it dominate versus potence. These are two disciplines that overall are both very influential and very powerful disciplines that exist in VTES. And I argue that they are fundamentally the same thing in a different way.
And before we start fully getting into it, we might do another comparison of disciplines. Like we want to go into the topic in general. So, just why did we pick potence and discipline? Because they're, I think, something good to start at. Like most people have a good view on what they can do or can't.
Yeah, and they're very well opposed to each other. They have a very distinct opposition point. So, yeah, let's roll an intro and then see where we get to in this conversation. All right, so as it goes, it's always nice when Jan and I disagree on something. It's also nice when we agree on things, but I think it's more entertaining for people.
Is when he, that's my opinion.
Yeah, okay. So far, I think you're what? 1 for 3, 1 for 2, something like that?
Yeah, I don't remember. I don't know.
But yeah, so what we've got here is sort of the way this sort of came up is we've been talking about an idea on and off for a little while about kind of going through the disciplines and comparing whether or not the discipline is kind of doing its function, whether or not it feels like what it should be, whether or not it feels like it's meaningful in the game, just kind of like an overview of a few different disciplines. But we ended up in a conversation about like the depth of dominate versus the lack of depth of potence. Would you say it's an accurate way to represent it?
Yeah. Also for potence, I think it's honestly a unfortunate discipline because one of the main things I find.
Would you say it has a lot of potential, by the way?
Nah, not right now. Not for my pun, generally. But like, why do animalism and potence? I am a loving Nosferatu player, as some might know.
As sad as it might be for him.
Very well, but I was also wondering why the disciplines don't fit together. And one of the points I got to was like, both disciplines have no actions for themselves. Like they feel meaningful. Like animalism has more actions, like retainers mostly. But potence has like one or two meaningful actions, which are by just meant by themselves, like no anarch requirement, no outside disciplines, just potence. And dominate is very opposed to that. Like I think there's little in the game you can't influence in a way with potence, with dominate.
Yeah, I would largely agree. Like looking over, I'm pulling it up for people to see, but looking over like just starting at actions, Dominate has a lot more effectively things that it can do from an action perspective. Even if we exclude things like amalgams or things that are stapled onto other disciplines, there's still a large variety of things between moving vampires out of your ash or your crypt to use as bleeders, bleeding, stealing locations, stealing vampires, influencing vampires, stealing allies, making it harder for people to bleed. Like there's so many things that Dominate can do, and when you compare that, obviously, to Potence, their actions are like deal a damage to a minion and lock something, blow up a location, get stronger, which they already have Potence. Like it feels a little bit thin, especially when you remove Anarch from it. It feels very straightforward. In fact, a thing I've always found very fascinating about Potence is that by itself, base Potence can't rush a vampire.
There's no potence, like no potence action without requirement, which opens up rushes, and even animalism does that. And I
Yeah,
think that's quite a problem.
it's very strange, like that I need to be an Anarch in order to get a rush on a vampire. I'm just double checking here because I feel almost like this can't be true, but as I'm looking at the cards right
It is.
now, you have to do something else to get yourself in combat. And if somebody like you're sort of using that like an intimidation strategy, but why does Potence not get something as simple as the very thing that Potence wants to do? Are we afraid that we'll make Potence too strong? Because last I checked, using non-disciplined stuff, it doesn't really like make the grade. In fact, I believe I've done this before, but let me double check comparatively. So that's Potence, and I know this is pretty run of the mill, but that's animalism. There is a very distinct difference in tournament winning decks that have Potence versus tournament winning decks that have animalism. So with animalism in 2024, 119 decks had animalism. In 2024, 34 decks, or I'm sorry, in 2024, 40 decks had animalism. So far, none in 2025 had. And if we go to 2023, Potence is at 34 decks, and animalism is at 57 decks. So there's still disparity between the two disciplines, even across what people are playing. Now, granted, this may not be decks that are using the animalism per se, but this is from the library, the disciplines that are in the cards that have that discipline in the deck. There is a significant advantage to animalism versus dominate.
And I mean, there's a very nice card called Deep Song, which gives animalism two key actions for what animalism wants to do: bleed, which is something you can always do, and rush. So um, you can do animalism combat quite easily if you have a good crypt, but you can do potence combat without anything else to rely on.
But let's go to what actual combat with Potence looks like. It is largely melee strikes. There are non-melee strikes in it. You do have a handful of cards that do give you ranged attacks, and some of them give you a maneuver, but the vast majority of them don't. And you always end up with this trade-off for your maneuver, where you are stuck having to, if anybody gets away from you, you're stuck having to close the distance. But whenever you're getting that maneuver, it has to be attached to something else to get that maneuver. You're always
Yeah.
just so big, slow, and brutish that that you can never catch anything the minute it walks away from you, even just a few steps. You're just stuck standing over here like, I move like this. And that's not what I feel like Potence should be.
Well, I think it's okay that there are not so many maneuvers, or that they are tied to something, or rather. Um,
But where's the versatility of something like for example, animalism has carrion crows, right? So they have a stock at any range, 2 damage to the opponent. Where is something like that for Potence besides Earthshock, which costs a full blood to use? Where is there like I just hit you with whatever is available, right? The like
well,
Mega Strike that's like
trade-off
random
is a card.
object.
The trade-off is a card called Immortal Grapple that if you are in range, you get it good.
Yeah, but we've talked before a little bit about how like it's so sad that as a Potence deck, there's such a dependency on Immortal Grapple. There's such a like I have to find grapple or this combat might be entirely pointless that leads people like cycle to get to a grapple, but then we'll end up with my only card in combat is grapple. It's like, okay, I still win because you punch me for one, but then combat's gonna end if you don't have superior, and even if it doesn't, you won't have grapple for next round.
Yeah, but I think I wouldn't add up more things to for Potence should be able to do in combat, but rather more stuff that Potence should be able to do on the table directly.
And this is where I sort of don't disagree with you. There's a bigger argument that's kind of being stated here that you're not mentioning. I appreciate it because I would like to save that for another time. And it's a very big can of worms to open up that we've hinted at having strong opinions about before. But it does feel a lot like Potence is missing one of the core things that Potence should have, which is just more ability to interact with the game that aren't dependent upon something else. That perpetual need to like get blocked or to have the rush card. It should be inbuilt into it, and it should not require you to pick cards that have implicit drawbacks. Rushing a vampire with the discipline that is all about like getting into combat should not come at like you gotta lose a hand size or they have to be locked or they're gonna get a strength bonus against you because you're smaller or like these are just not things that feel like what Potence should be stuck with overall.
And I think maybe if a main thing might also be the lack of modifiers. Like there's natively one Potence modifier, um, which doesn't require anything else, like being unlocked or whatever.
I mean, it does sort of require something, though, right? Because you're talking about Forger's Hammer, which requires you to have a weapon to go with it.
Yeah, fair enough.
They all have extra requirements. It's a discipline that is constantly gated by needing something else. It needs maneuvers from Celerity or from Obfuscate. It needs actions to be able to get started. It need like even their reaction pool. Their reaction pool is kind of cool. They have a really fun card, in my opinion, in Touch of Pain. But that's I think like the end of the reaction pool for them, right? Like yeah, it's Touch of Pain, the end.
Yeah, and Touch of Pain is a bad card.
It really is.
It costs 1 to inflict 1 damage on the acting minion.
Yep, and only one can be played per action, and it can only be a bleed or referendum. It's not just after any D-action against you. It's literally only after a bleed, which is just incredible. That the only way that a vampire with Potence can protect something is if it's their Methuselah. They can't like also do this when they're burning a location or stealing a vampire or burning a vampire or whatever else you want to do with Dominate.
Yeah, And dominate, like as I said in the beginning, this on the contrary, is very little which can be like retainers can be stolen. Is there even a rush?
I don't think Dominate gets a rush. Is in clan. Um,
That might be the one thing lacking, but dealing vampires is good enough anyways.
yeah, there's no rush as default action for Dominate. They get locking vampires. They even actually get a card that puts blood on a vampire as a sub discipline for something else, but that's not really as relevant.
Yeah, but and like dominate is, in my opinion, the strongest discipline in the game. Or it seems like general opinion rather. Um, and so I feel like it wouldn't hurt that if Potence could do more. Um, like burn locations or stuff with actions and with modifiers or reactions. Um, yeah, I
Yeah,
would.
but I wanna propose the opposite side of this because it sounds like right now we're agreeing on a lot of things, and we do have at least one static agreement, and that is that when it comes to a direct comparison between Potence and Dominate, Potence is significantly lacking for a lot that Dominate ultimately has. But our core argument that I had for this that I just want to like present here because I think it's important to think about, and I think that other people are going to argue this perspective when we talk about it, or if we don't talk about it, is effectively they want to do the same thing. And a lot of people could argue that VTES is a game all about wanting to do the same thing, right? It's a game about trying to minimize resources, and you minimize resources by doing, either damage or taking things. But Dominate is also supposed to be almost a counter to what Dominate is, or Potence is supposed to be almost a counter to what Dominate is. It's theoretically supposed to be a discipline that takes somebody who is trying to control minds and basically turns them into mush, essentially. It's also argued by some one of the stronger disciplines that you can have to counter a lot of strategies because of the aforementioned Immortal Grapple.
Yeah, but I don't feel like a discipline should be like a counter discipline in general. Like, sure, Orthlex is also a counter discipline for many things, like enabling blocks.
Mm-hmm.
But um, like we had the discussion with Hekata, where many people said they have 3 support disciplines. So what should they be able to do? Or they won't be able to do much. They won't be viable. And I think um, classifying some disciplines as support disciplines and not giving them meaningful actions by themselves, um, or maybe even modifiers by themselves.
Well, it's narrow thinking,
Could be
kind
interesting.
of.
Huh?
It's narrow thinking, kind of.
Yeah, it is.
Because when you think about it, like, okay, so let's think about like what is Potence overall, right? Sure, some people think of it as support discipline because it's, oh, you get like super jacked, right? But that's not how it is. That's not all that it does in the RPG. Is just makes you super jacked. There are other abilities that you gain via Potence. I am
You
now.
can
Yeah, go ahead.
you can climb, um, like hang down the ceiling for a long time. I think
Mm-hmm.
I need to check
Yeah,
what buttons
I
those.
was actually literally about to do the same thing. I wish we would have thought to do that ahead of time, um, but there are, when we get into it, a lot of interesting things that it can do. Um, so one of the things is obviously enhanced movement. So celerity, like being able
Oh,
to leap through the air at long distances.
The Rod of Might turned their VTES into a potence boost for others.
Yeah.
So you could have one vampire, which like one big cap potence vampire, which helps to fuel your other combats, like so you can defend better, for example.
Yeah, there's stuff like Brutal Feed as well, which is basically to take something that you're feeding on to give some benefit of it. Wait, is it give to others? Hold on.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Uncanny Grip,
Yeah.
which allowing them to climb or hang unsupported, like climbing up Eiffel Tower or whatever.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways that this discipline could be used in more interesting mechanics than just feeling like it's kind of a solo, but also a support discipline. Like right now, it's very strange because having Immortal Grapple makes Potence feel like it's supposed to stand on its own, but it kind of doesn't. You can't win on Potence alone. I would love to see someone prove me wrong on this, but I feel like you could win a game on Dominate alone. And I've seen pretty close to that be true, where you are literally just playing Dominate in the form of, bleeding past something, minimal stealth. Maybe you have a few. Do what?
Dominate weenies should be a thing.
Yeah, it is. It's actively a thing. Like it's crazy that Dominate is such a standalone discipline because it defends and it attacks and it has its own solutions to combat. Obedience is easily one of the most obnoxious cards to deal with when you are trying to like play a combat deck. The fact that your entire combat strategy is just disabled by a single card is crazy to me. And from a discipline that ultimately like should have some ability to if it has the ability to incite rage upon somebody, there should be some amount of that is able to overtake the mental controls that are attempting to happen and continue to allow them to push past. But unfortunately, I need presence to go along with that before I get the ability to cancel any sort of thing that's affecting me in that manner. And that just seems strange to me. From a discipline that is about like being able to focus your hostility into like manifested purposes.
And I think like the line of thought with Rod of Might, using it as a support for other vampires on your you have, or maybe even cross table, would be very meaningful, in my opinion. This would mean maybe make people include a strong level potence vampire in a otherwise orientated crypt because they can help them survive combat in some way, or dissuade people to try to block all the weenies. So I think the stuff is there in the RPG, and also VTES mechanics-wise, it wouldn't be unheard of or completely unthinkable.
Well, to turn Soaring Leap into an action modifier that gives you a single point of stealth, you hop over the opposing vampire and just keep going, the blocking vampire, and just keep going.
Yeah. Same with Uncanny Grip. Like, allowing to climb or hang unsupported. Big, like Spider-Man or whoever on the outside and breaking in the 11th floor. Why not?
Well, it feels like ultimately it's because there's a boogeyman here, right? let's actually poke a little bit at your one of the positions you stated. The problem of combat. And I don't want to poke too far into this. Let's be clear. I want to just dip a toe in here, right? Your position is maybe combat is bad for the game. And my position is combat is not, it's not bad for the game. It's just mechanically estranged from the game. There's something about combat that needs to be improved because the game needs some kind of mechanic, right? Where blocking matters or where being blocked matters.
Man, he's taking words out of my mouth and twisting them. What I meant
Typical
was like,
Ventru.
very true. Ventru. But I think if we had in combat, Potence would already have meaningful actions. Because we have combat, the whole discipline is shifted so heavily into this single mechanism of the game that it's, in my opinion, shallow in comparison to the main event. Like, combat is a side event, like nothing which wins your games by itself. It's always embedded in something, in another strategy.
Yeah, that's the point I'm kind of getting at here. So you're setting it up really well because at the end of the day, because Potence has been given that status, it's risky to let it grow, I think. I think the boogeyman is if we give Potence the tools that it needs, now Potence becomes a bigger problem than we want it to end up being.
I mean we should ban Immortal Grapple?
No. I don't think the only problem therein is grapple, right? Let's say that Potence has more direct ability to stand alone as itself. You now don't have to make a crypt that worries about secondary disciplines. You can just focus on, I'm going to run Potence, which now means your cards are much more narrow. Your plan is, I'm going to deal damage to whatever I can, as much as I can at every instance. So if I get a bleed card and I get a stealth card, that's a way for me to deal damage to my opponent. But if I get blocked, I also have some of the strongest cards for dealing damage to that opponent. And if I get a maneuver card to go with that, now I'm also nimble in combat and can do all the things. I think the problem is Potence makes a bit of a boogeyman here. And I'm wondering if it's not like, if we give them a bleed card, does the bleed card suddenly kick them up a notch? If we give them a unlimited rush, does that give them a little too much? Does it give them just the edge they need to suddenly now it's a problem?
I don't think that's true, because if we look at B5 and the clans which have Potence, or namely Bruja, they have their own Potence rush card in V5 Bruja deck. Like, I don't know if it was first, but what's it called?
Well, they're not all anarchs, they're not all, and there's the Nosferatu, your favorite that
but what's called which gives you bleed, steel pool,
Line Brawl.
or
Line Brawl.
Thank you. Line Brawl gives a rush widely available, and the deck, like, the game hasn't broken.
Yeah, but the difference here, I get. Oh God, I'm sorry.
On what the actions and or the modifiers would do. Just giving them rushes might be not the way, because that would lead to just might lead to the situation you described. But if it were like giving them the ability to burn a location or
I do technically have burn a location. That one they do have.
yeah, fair enough.
Right now, their
Like
actions consist of
meaningful
dealing damage to something or burn a
interactions with
location.
resources on the table,
hmm
aside from vampires. I think that would up uh, give it a boost, make it easier to include or to just for versatility and less focus on combat alone.
I largely agree, but I still think we end up with that boogeyman happening. And I think that the boogeyman becomes more real now because Potence does just a little bit more. I genuinely wonder this for a while, because when you look at like what happens when a non-Potence deck or a more defensive deck slips and it can't handle like Potence for just a moment, it's basically the end, right? A vampire is just done in a lot of cases.
You could say the same for dominate bleed defense.
I would agree 100%. The first time, it's almost like the first time somebody misses on a bounce, that's it. Dominate falls apart almost entirely, because now it's like, oh shit, the door's open. Let me send the rest of the crew in immediately because this might be my only shot. The difference is there. Usually that happens. It's dominate versus dominate. It's discipline versus discipline. But with Potence, it isn't Potence versus Potence when that happens. It's Potence versus X other discipline, which means Potence has the advantage in that circumstance.
That's not true, because if we take bleed as an analogy, I don't know if it's a good one yet. But you have various bounces.
Sure.
Like bait and switch is disciplineless, requires a baron, has orb resistance,
but it's exhaustible, right? The only discipline with non-exhaustible, like something that doesn't more substantially remove your resources, is dominate. It's the only one that can, after bouncing, bounce again and bounce again and bounce again without having to play an extra card in between. One vampire with enough blood can bounce an entire squad of vampires bleeding.
I think maybe an action, Potence would profit of an action which people could pay the blood, like the damage made to their vampire, or some of that, by pool. So you would remain in combat, hit for 4, and people would say, okay, I need 2 blood on my vampire, so I pay 2 pool.
That's kind of mechanically messy. I would argue more so the other way. I would argue that like Potence should give something that's much easier to like trick, right? So you'd have something that's like bleed at whatever bleed, but the bleed can't be redirected. But you can instead of taking the bleed, choose to give a minion the damage that would be dealt to you, the bleed that would be dealt to you. Right, so this is, you've got this like big Brusian. He's running your building, your big, estate that you run, or like your big apartment built complex that you're managing, and he's about to like knock this shit in and make a bunch of people want to leave. Right, but they know the guy knows what you're supposed to look like, what his target thing is supposed to look like. So you throw some guy out there and you're like, hey, guess what? You're the new property manager. Congratulations, buddy. And the rather than breaking the building now, the Bruja just like beats the shit out of this guy and is like, yeah, you've learned your lesson.
This card is called Show of Force.
It's sort of what Show of Force is supposed to be, but that's not what I'm looking for. So Show of Force means that there's direct combat. This is the acceptance of the damage that's going to be caused, right? The idea behind bleeding is you know how much the person is instructed to do.
You would forgo combat.
You would forgo combat. You just throw the minion in front of it and they take the damage that you would take. So maybe like if, for example, it's them burning down that building, there you convince them no, it's Jimmy's apartment complex down the street.
I think both mechanics might be worth investigating
But this is
because
hypotheticals, and you know how I feel about being overly hypothetical.
yeah, but we're talking about what disciplines are lacking.
Yes.
So it's fine to talk about what disciplines, how the lack of a discipline might be addressed.
Sort of. My issue is when we get if you get too precise, you could miss out on some of what the nuance is to the discipline. And I think the nail really is in this case that it's a discipline that feels risky. Right? The reason to me that I think dominate and potence are good disciplines to compare to each other is I do feel like potence is very close to being a best discipline slot. I would almost the next discipline I would probably put above this, but I also think that it's already a better discipline is Protean, right? Like Protean really is the go-to like if we were just
Proteans,
comparing best versus best, then it would be Protean versus Dominate probably as
yeah,
two of the best comparisons. But that's not what I'm going for here because what I want to compare is Dominate and the potential for Potence to be a Dominate if you're not careful, but in a different mechanism, right? Protean requires you to do very different things to do what Dominate does. But Potence is more directly what Dominate is. Potence is I am going to remove some amount of assets from you that are in the form of beads or cardboard in exchange for my cards or actions, and it's going to be a larger number of those things than what I'm going to spend to do it. That is the pointed thing between the two of them. Single action, most value of resources possible with each thing. Um, yeah.
I know. But if you would like the two things we discussed, either let people pay with pool for the blood and the vampire, like to mend damage instead, um, or or just let a minion take damage instead of you. I think that's quite a different field instead to dominate, which goes directly at you. Like
I would agree, but the second issue I see here is the problem of like mechanical consistency and flavor. So this is like having a card that allows the user to have reverse choice. Like for the example of I have a card that attacks a player, something can block, but then I can also still take some of the damage in between. Is more like giving a partial reaction card to the minion. Both cards are partial reaction cards. Just one partial reaction card is one that gives the opponent more choice and also makes more sense mechanically than the other. Potence doesn't make a Methuselah, doesn't give a Methuselah some ability to suddenly be there that's different than what the rest of things could be. But Potence would allow something where something is so enraged that it only goes after the one thing that it's supposed to. Theoretically, this Potence card would also be like, it can't be bounced, or it would have to be some limitation to that can't be bounced, but it would be something where the player absolutely has to make a decision about what they're going to do about this if they are not able to block it. Whereas in the other situation, like flavor wise, a Methuselah theoretically could have some ability to just intervene at any point and take damage. It's actually a surprise to me that in the game of VTES, there isn't more of a card that is like, that gives the Methuselah some greater direct interaction. But there's always been in the game this idea that like you're too shadowy and too far away from the actual goings on.
the point is, pool is your influence. So you paying pool would mean you spending your influence, like social credits.
Right, but
Um, rescue
why would potence give an ability that shouldn't already be implicit to the Methuselah in that case?
because otherwise, Potent is just gonna dunk vampires all along and make the game unfun.
Right, but what you're looking at though is not, you can't just, when you're building a card mechanically, there are things that have to go into it. This is actually another place I thought maybe this would go, but you have to make sure that one of the checkboxes is, it needs to be, especially with what BCP says that their end goal of this is, it has to feel mechanically sound and it has to feel logically sound enough, right? So
Yeah.
you're generating a card where Potence is a discipline, generates a power in the individual that allows a Methuselah to do something that they can't naturally do in the game.
And he said he didn't want to speculate.
Yes. This is why I don't want to speculate, because this is what you end up with when you do speculation. When you do speculation, you end up with very immediate, wouldn't this be cool mechanically, but then you end up in Magic the Gathering country where the cards don't even remotely taste like anything anymore. The cards are just like, oh, our flavor is we have Marvel characters.
I was just meaning to say, like, it's just ideas on a very conceptual level.
And I get that, but I just want to
flesh it out. I think that would delve too deep for today.
Yes.
But in any case, I think what we can salvage from the discussion is there are possible mechanics which can feel like Potence and give it more interaction, like direct interaction with the prey or other Methuselahs on the table.
Yeah, and not feel like it's just a stapled on afterthought. And I feel like going back to the Nosferatu, that's kind of, so let's actually take for a second here. I'm a little aside, but related to this topic. Let's think about for a second the difference between the Nosferatu and the Hecata, right? Because here you have two different clans that both have support discipline, support discipline, support discipline, and support discipline, support discipline, support discipline, right? Animalism, obfuscate, and potence. One could argue animalism is supposed to be a support discipline. More recently became not.
Main discipline, but
yes.
Fair enough.
But then the Hekatar also, fortitude, obtenebration, or not obtenebration, oblivion, and auspex. Ultimately, what ended up happening to both oblivion and to animalism is they exist far enough in a liminal space that they are potentially primary disciplines. In fact, we've seen animalism be a fully successful independent discipline all on its own. It's weird because it's the kind of deck that when you watch it play functions a little bit like, that your brain says mechanically this probably shouldn't work, but it also sees it function and you understand but it does work because you kind of have to be prepared to deal with it in a certain way, and most decks do not necessarily have the means to deal with it in that way, especially because it's basically 3 cards to stay consistent, right? But really it's just that there is one potentially problematic card in that, and that potentially problematic card was literally just Deep Song, or it was Deep Song. And that kind of leans back to the point I'm trying to make about Potence, which is like, Deep Song is a card that essentially, in my opinion, moved animalism from a support discipline to a valid discipline and made an entire deck that did really well in terms of tournament performance. Do we want that same thing to happen to Potence, where we add a card and suddenly Potence is now gone from a tier D discipline at best, but except in niche in certain situations, to a potentially tier S situation where you have to plan around this is a deck format?
Well, let's say why not? The only thing we would get is more versatility, because it wouldn't render stealth, dominate stealth bleed, or the other strategies invalid. It would just add up more. It would just add up on variety you can encounter, which is a good thing. And that would be also an argument for the action, if there were something to be designed to be less combat heavy. So combat doesn't become a too dominant part to prepare in the whole table.
So I think at the core of this, then, we mostly are in the same state of agreement. Because I definitely agree with you there on, like, there isn't a huge risk, right? Like, if we produce a car, as long as there's a modicum of carefulness taken in this, as long as, like, what we've talked about is thought about, like, inadvertently creating a boogeyman, right? Maybe the worst case scenario is we create an animalism situation, but it doesn't necessarily have to break other disciplines. It just gives Potence an ability to shine in a way that it doesn't before. Ultimately, then, I forget what my initial point was. That's annoying. Silly free flow of thought. Ultimately, that means that what the aim here is to ensure the bigger question is that what we want from disciplines? Do we want disciplines to stand alone? Is implicitly the design supposed to be support disciplines?
Well, if that wouldn't be the case, then you can still design cards like the Rod of Might, which, like, on disciplines in the RPG, which exists where you can lend your VTES to others. So enhancing the support discipline character of Potence, but in a different way instead of putting more stuff into combat.
So here, my position though is I don't want to be in the middle here. I want to be pretty clear. So my position is a little different, and that is that I think I do want disciplines to stand alone. I don't want a discipline to be support. I want it to be unique. I want it to be something that could stand on its own. It doesn't have to be tier 1 standing on its own, but I think that every discipline should have something, like, when you pick up the discipline, it should feel like more than just something I have to do with something else. I should then think about, what could I do with these cards with another thing?
You want to say every discipline needs meaningful actions.
I would say that but that is what I mean by saying that every discipline should be able to stand alone.
Yeah.
I think that every discipline, there's some rare exceptions, but
standalone is, for me, I think, like, functioning fully on its own, like,
not fully.
Animalism. But I think every discipline should have meaningful actions, whether they are support or
right,
like aggressive or defensive, but they should be meaningful.
No, see, there's still a difference between what we're both saying. So to me, standalone functions like this, and Magic players will kind of understand what I'm saying, but I'll try to break this down. Right, in the original ideas of Richard Garfield for Magic the Gathering, the 5 colors of Magic each had an identity, and each of them could be played by themselves, but they all had a pivotal weakness. There was always something that they couldn't do that other people could do, or something that they could do but the other colors would do better. Right, and here in VTES, that is what I would like to see. You could choose to run on a solo discipline, but if you run on that solo discipline, there is something that you're missing that makes you weak, but not something you're missing that makes you, like, mechanically inviable, right? And that's what Potence is. Potence is mechanically unviable by itself, whereas many other disciplines, you could argue, are significantly less mechanically unviable because they have something in their toolbox that pushed them over the edge. The next closest to mechanically unviable, I would say, is probably like Auspex, but
No, it isn't. It's mechanically viable because you have reactions which can directly interact with actions, but Potence has no rush, like
yes, no
without
base rush. Yes.
and no way to gain intercept by itself. So you have no means
Yes, to get into
to
combat
get into
naturally.
combat
Yeah.
with Potence alone.
But so just a quick scope to make it clear. The reason I say that Auspex is not quote unquote viable as a standalone is blocking is not just a game, is not the game mechanic alone. Blocking comes with forcible attachments, and there's nothing that Auspex necessarily does on its own to make itself like more than just a block. So which is what turns Auspex into a support discipline. Its actions only give it support, and its cards are basically supportive of some other discipline in tow. So that's why I say Auspex is probably the next closest to Potence, with Celerity somewhere close in that same realm, along with Obfuscate. I would say that like these are the disciplines that like they're almost like designed specifically to just be a support. And if that's what we want to be, if that's what we want them to be, then that's fine. But niches need to be carved out. But Potence always feels so much like somebody feels like it's supposed to stand alone. It feels like the intention for Potence is to be, I want to fight things and I'm going to fight things. But
yeah,
that seems opposed to what Potence feels like when you play it, which is, I want to fight things. How do I find a fight? So I think ultimately we both agree that Potence is missing something. You feel like it's actions. I feel like actions are missing from part of the equation. But I feel like Potence lacks an identity other than, I'm going to swing my arms like this. And if you get in the way, that's on you. And obviously, if you just walk in a straight line and nobody's in that line, well, cool. You spun your fists around, but you exert a lot of effort for no action.
But I think it's worth discussing what that it's a good start for our potential series.
Yeah.
See what should be viable on the table. Like, I think actions like is the way to go because this is how you play. But
yeah. So like I said at the beginning, this whole topic, this whole conversation is an experiment of ours. We had this conversation. We knew we wanted to record something. We were willing to see whether or not this would go. I think I'm going to post this, but I'm going to post this with this. I'm at the end of the video. So if you're still listening, congratulations. You're in the minority of people. But if you can do us one extra solid and let us know, first of all, if you like the idea of us doing this. And then second of all, I want to know, and I genuinely want to know, like, how you feel about this. Do you feel like Potence is only a step or two away from being a tier 1 discipline? Do you feel like Potence would need a full rework to be a tier 1 discipline? Do you think we're both wrong and Potence is a perfectly fine discipline and it's great and it's the only discipline that does something? Just make sure when you make that argument, you're not throwing extra disciplines on the table. You're not throwing extra masters from a specific clan on the table. Just make sure you're not throwing extra... Yeah. Think solely about Potence as its standalone when you're going to present that argument. We'll both be happy to discuss it with you. We have had some interesting threads in various different places about a lot of topics. So if you are interested, please give us some feedback, give us some intel. I really want to know, we really want to know, like, is this a good idea for something to discuss. I would love to get into more of these kind of meta style conversations about things, because I think that's what the game like is about. It's about like the interactions beyond just the service layer of what are these cards, what do they do, how do they work, what do I do with these cards, and I want to get into like what is a discipline, why are disciplines like this, what is proper play, what can we do with the way that we play to change it and make it better. So your feedback is super important, super valuable, especially if you would like to see us continue in this direction. Anything else you want to add, Jan?
No,
uh,
but other than thank you guys for listening in. And yeah, happy for your feedback.
yep, thank you. Take care, guys.